This tutorial will show you how to build this gauge from the beach barren. To build any component, we need to be in component mode by clicking the component mode button. Next we need to give the component a type, in our case, it's a gauge. Next change the size of the component canvas to your requirements, in our case, because the gauge is round, the width and height should be the same. Gauges have layers instead of states. Consider an actual gauge, looking at it from the side. It would have layers such as the back plate and bevel, the background, the needle, the glass. Layers are also important if a part on the gauge needs to be configured with a variable. For example, a part that moves or an LED that lights up. These parts must exist on their own layer. A gauge is not interactive, so disable gestures. Clicking on background shows the canvas for the background layer. We can now add an image of a bevel. This is optional for physical cockpit builders, as you would probably have an actual bevel and glass mounted on your panel. Next we will add a black circle to represent the face background of the gauge. Lowering the Z-index of the circle will position it behind the bevel. Next we will use the advanced background color function to lighten the circle. There are three part types that are useful for building the markings on a gauge faceplate. These are hub spoke part, hub spoke gauge part, and hub spoke instrument part. They are all based on the same technology, but come pre-configured in different ways. The hub spoke is pre-configured to present as a range selector. The hub spoke gauge is pre-configured as a fuel gauge with a shallow arc. Finally, the hub spoke instrument is pre-configured as an airspeed dial. They can all be customized to meet your exact needs. First we must set the new part, foreground color to an off-white. We will use the hub spoke part, as this presents its markings or spokes in a circular fashion. We will add two hub spoke parts. The reason for this is that the markings around the dial are not consistent. We will build the larger markings on one hub spoke, and then add the smaller ones on the other. The spokes are currently configured to increase in length as they are drawn around the center point, so we need to set the spoke length increment to 0. By increasing the center offset, we can make the part larger. Changing the spoke length value will change the length of the spokes. When centering any hub spoke part, it will be centered on its center point, making it much easier to get the correct position on the faceplate, and to correctly align multiple hub spoke parts. We have previously measured the start angle of the gauge we are reproducing. This was done using the free program mentioned in this video description. In Flight Simulator, show a 2D panel of the part, and then measure the start and end angles of the markings and the different angles between each interval. There are 4 large markings, so we set the spoke quantity to 4. We will keep adjusting the center offset and spoke distance to get the correct look. It's clear that the label numbers are incorrect and positioned incorrectly. This is making it hard to see what is happening, so it's time to adjust these. The gauge number starts at 3, so we set start number to 3. Each number increases by 1, so we set the increment to 1 and the multiplier to 0. We now need the label numbers to appear at the other end of the spokes. Do this by enabling labels inside. Altering the distance will move the label numbers further from the spokes. Zooming out so that the gauge size matches what you are seeing in the flight simulator will help you assess authenticity and to determine what needs to change. The 0-180 degrees shift value will alter the distance of labels around the angle 0 and 180, so labels 4 and 5 will be adjusted. We will now add the second hub spoke part, for the minor increment markings. We will follow the same process as before, but we will stop any labels appearing. The larger of the two small increment markings will be the major spokes, and the smaller ones will be configured as minor spokes. It's very important that both hub spoke parts have the same center offset value. This ensures they will line up correctly. We can now add the minor spokes. Minor spokes are configured in relation to the major spokes. The quantity sets the number of spokes between each major spoke. The minor spoke's length will be the same as the major spokes unless we configure the length reduction value. Click the Add button to add the minor spokes. Zooming out so that the gauge size matches what you are seeing in the flight simulator will help you assess authenticity and to determine what needs to change. We can determine the center point of the gauge by enabling the Show Crosshairs option on any hub spoke part. This assists when aligning parts from other layers. We can now add text parts for the gauge writing. We can fine-tune the position using the keyboard arrow keys. We can make the hub spoke label numbers become actual text parts so they can be adjusted. This is done by enabling labels as text parts. Clicking on layer 1 shows the canvas for that layer. We will now draw a horizontal line part, which will become the needle. We can make the needle pointed by setting the stroke start line cap to a triangle. It's very important that the height and width of the line are exactly the same. If they are not, it will not rotate consistently. We need to see the other parts, so we can align the needle. Do this by clicking on the View menu and selecting Show All Parts on All States. The needle needs to be moved, so that the orange adorner around it is just over the crosshairs. It may take a few attempts to get the length of the needle correct by changing the width and height of it, and then moving it back to the correct position. Remember, the width and height must be the same. We need to indicate that this part rotates. The rotation center point is the bottom right corner. We can now check that the needle is aligned correctly. It should line up exactly with the crosshairs when we change the angle. Most gauges point to 0 as their initial needle position. In our case, the interval range is limited and so it does not sit at 0. We know that the interval angle between the 3 and the first interval is 10, as this was set in the hub spoke part. Therefore, the smallest interval must be every 5 degrees, which is half of 10. It looks like the needle is pointing to a small interval, which we can check by changing the angle to 5 degrees, to see if it points to the next interval. The needle is pointing to a value of 2.5, therefore the needle initial value is 2.25. The end value is the last increment value, which is 6.5. Some gauge needles travel past the last increment, so you can increase this number if you wish. The minimum rotate angle is 0 for this gauge because it does not travel below its starting position. The max rotate angle is the angle of the final interval. In practice, some gauge needles do go beyond the final interval, so you could add another 5 or 10 degrees if you wish. If the gauge does extend beyond the final interval, the end value and the max rotate angle must be in sync. You can also calculate the final interval angle by examining the hub spoke part that draws the final interval. Take the angle interval and multiply it by the spoke quantity minus 1, in our case 10 times 8, gives us 80. Because the needle is 5 degrees off the start interval, we need to add the 5 degrees, giving a total of 85 degrees. We can now work on layer 2, which is the needle center. We will add 2 circle parts. We can now add the final text on the faceplate, because we now have a needle center point as a reference. We can now add an LED part on layer 3. We set the unlit color on the LED first. We can now click the Colors menu and select the Unlit Color to Foreground Color option. We have now defined the unlit color for all parts. We can now set the color of the LED when it's lit. It's clear that the text is too far from the LED. The issue was resolved by slightly increasing the size of the needle center circle, which then allowed the text to move further down the faceplate. We will draw the line markings on layer 3, and then copy and paste them to the background. The reason for this is that clicking and drawing the lines on the background would stop the line being drawn, as the bevel image would be selected instead. Now for some final adjustments. We can optionally add a simple glass effect onto layer 4. Now name and save the gauge component. This concludes our tutorial. I hope you found it useful.